The tension inside the Capitol hearing room was thick enough to feel. Cameras lined the walls, staffers whispered nervously, and members of Congress shifted in their leather chairs. Everyone knew this wasn't going to be an ordinary oversight hearing, not with Hakeem Jeffries and Karoline Leavitt sitting on opposite ends of the table. But no one expected the moment that would ignite the room. It happened fast, the kind of flashpoint that rewrites the entire tone of a hearing. Karoline referenced her Catholic faith while explaining a policy stance, speaking calmly, her hands folded, her voice steady. And then Hakeem Jeffries leaned back, smirked, and said into the microphone loud enough for the cameras to catch, "Faith isn't a policy argument, Ms. Leavitt. Leave the prayers for Sunday." A ripple of awkward laughter rolled through a few Democratic seats, but the rest of the room froze. Karoline's expression didn't break, not even a blink. And that silence? That was the hook. Everyone felt it. She slowly lifted her eyes from her notes, the kind of controlled, deliberate movement that made every camera in the room lock onto her. Her posture straightened, her jaw set. She didn't look offended. She looked ready. Jeffries chuckled again, leaning forward like he'd just scored a clever political point. But the audience, the staffers, the press, even some members of his own side, shifted uncomfortably. Because mocking her argument was one thing. Mocking her faith, on record, was another. Karoline finally spoke, her voice calm but carrying an unmistakable steel edge beneath it. "Leader Jeffries," she said slowly, "I reference my faith because it's part of why I fight for millions of Americans who feel unheard by leaders like you. If that makes you uncomfortable, that's your problem, not theirs." A few heads snapped up. Jeffries raised an eyebrow, but Karoline continued before he could jump in. "You laugh at my faith," she said, "yet you expect Americans to trust your moral compass. You tell me to save the prayers for Sunday. But millions of Americans pray every day, in schools, in homes, in hospitals, in moments of fear and hope, and they deserve leaders who don't mock them for it." The room went still, tight, electric. Even staffers who'd been typing stopped mid-keystroke. Karoline leaned forward slightly, locking eyes with Jeffries. "If you think faith has no place in public life," she said, "then you don't understand the country you claim to lead." A gasp rolled across the hearing room. Someone whispered, "Oh my God." Another staffer mouthed, "She got him." Jeffries shifted in his chair, suddenly uncomfortable, the smirk fading from his face. He wasn't prepared for her to meet his jab with a direct, unshakable strike. Karoline closed her binder as calmly as she'd opened it and added one more line, the one that made the headlines. Before the hearing even ended, "You can laugh at me, Congressman, but don't you dare laugh at the millions of Americans whose faith is stronger than your politics." The flashbulbs burst instantly. The hearing room erupted, and Hakeem Jeffries realized, too late, that he had awakened the wrong opponent. The chamber lights glared down like judgment as murmurs rippled through Congress. Hakeem Jeffries, standing confidently at the podium, smirked as if he'd already won a game no one else knew he started. Cameras zoomed in. Staffers leaned forward. The room sensed tension, real tension, building between the minority leader and the youngest press secretary in modern political history. Karoline Leavitt stood a few feet away, her posture straight, her expression composed, her fingers lightly resting on the notes she didn't actually need. The silver cross she wore caught the overhead lights, flickering like a spark waiting for oxygen. Hakeem gestured toward her. "You know," he said loudly, voice dripping with sarcasm, "some people come here ready to legislate, and others come ready to preach." The laughter from his side of the aisle erupted instantly. Forced, theatrical, but loud enough to echo off the chamber walls. A few lawmakers shook their heads, smirking as if they'd just witnessed a rookie get benched. Karoline didn't move, didn't flinch. She simply lifted her eyes and studied him the way a surgeon studies a patient before making the first cut. Hakeem continued, emboldened. "We're here to discuss policy, not listen to faith-based fairy tales. If Ms. Leavitt wants to lecture America about religion, maybe she should find a pulpit instead of a podium. Another round of chuckles. A few cameras pivoted toward Karoline, waiting for her to crumble, shrink, apologize, something. But she remained still, steadying her breath, letting the silence sharpen around her. Then she stepped forward. Not rushed, not rattled. Controlled, like someone who knew the room was about to flip. "Leader Jeffries," she began, voice calm but resonant, "you can mock my faith all you want, but you don't get to rewrite the First Amendment just because it inconveniences your narrative." The laughter on his side faltered. Karoline moved closer to the center of the room, claiming space he thought belonged to him. "You may think people of faith don't belong in government, but last I checked, America wasn't built on your approval. Millions of Americans pray before they work, pray before they vote, pray before they send their kids into a world your policies helped make unsafe." A few lawmakers straightened in their seats. Karoline didn't pause. "You think calling my faith a joke makes you clever? All it does is expose how disconnected you are from the very voters you claim to fight for." The murmurs shifted, no longer mocking, now curious. Hakeem blinked, his smirk slipping. Karoline's voice, dropped, controlled, and razor-sharp. "And if my faith intimidates you, that says more about your leadership than it ever will about my beliefs." Silence. A rare, heavy silence. Even the cameras froze, because in that moment, everyone felt it. Karoline hadn't just answered him. She had taken the room. The tension inside the chamber thickened as Hakeem Jeffries stepped closer to the microphone, confidence dripping from every measured word. He thought he had the crowd. He thought he had Karoline cornered. And when he made the mistake of mocking her faith, twisting it into a punchline, his allies behind him chuckled like they were watching late-night comedy, not a congressional debate. But the laughter didn't last. Karoline didn't flinch. She didn't blink. She didn't even shift her weight. Instead, she stood completely still, letting his smirk fade into silence. The room grew so quiet that even the cameras seemed to hold their breath. "Congressman," she finally said, her voice calm but carrying the weight of a hammer about to drop, "don't confuse my faith with weakness. It's the only reason I can stand here and look corruption in the eye without trembling." A ripple spread through the chamber, lawmakers straightening in their seats, staffers leaning forward, the public gallery whispering to one another. She took a slow step forward, eyes fixed on Jeffries. "You mock what I believe," she continued, "because you don't understand what real conviction looks like. Conviction that isn't for sale. Conviction that doesn't bend with political winds. Conviction that actually means something." Jeffries' smile tightened. He wasn't expecting her to counter like that. Not with poise, not with fire, not with a voice that carried farther than his microphone ever could. Karoline wasn't finished. "You want to lecture America about unity while mocking millions of people for their faith? That's not leadership. That's arrogance wrapped in a soundbite." Gasps echoed from both sides of the aisle. Karoline raised her chin. "And let me be very clear," she said, every syllable hitting like a drumbeat. "If you think faith disqualifies someone from speaking truth to power, then you're not defending democracy. You're trying to control it." The chamber erupted. Whispers, shock, scattered applause that grew louder despite attempts to gavel it down. Even some members of Jeffries' own caucus shifted nervously, realizing Karoline had just flipped the room. Jeffries tried to regain control, raising a hand. "Let's be serious." But Karoline hit him with the line that would dominate headlines for the next 24 hours. "I am being serious, Congressman. The problem is you got comfortable thinking no one would ever say these things to your face." The room froze. Jeffries' expression collapsed into stunned silence. Karoline stepped back from the mic, letting the weight of her words settle over Congress like a storm cloud finally breaking open. She hadn't just defended her faith. She had turned the entire chamber against him. The chamber was still vibrating from the clash in the previous moments, a low hum of whispers and shifting chairs filling the air as members tried to process what they had just witnessed. Hakeem Jeffries sat rigidly at the center of it all, jaw tight, fingers drumming the table with a rhythm that betrayed irritation. He had expected a brief exchange, maybe even a moment to embarrass Karoline in front of millions. Instead, she had turned his mockery into a national spectacle, and now the whole chamber felt like it was leaning in her direction. Karoline stood tall behind the witness microphone, her cross glinting under the harsh overhead lights, her posture steady but energized. She wasn't finished, not even close. There was something in her eyes, a sharpness, a conviction, that made every camera in the room tighten focus. Hakeem leaned forward, trying to reclaim control. "Miss Leavitt," he said, voice dripping with condescension, "your emotional storytelling may work on social media, but this is Congress. We deal in facts, not feelings." A few allies behind him nodded, but even they didn't look convinced. Karoline didn't blink. "Good," she said calmly. "Let's deal in facts, then." A murmur rippled through the chamber. She placed both hands on the desk and spoke slowly, deliberately, each word landing with the precision of a hammer on steel. "Fact. Violent crime in cities you praise as models has skyrocketed. Fact. Families of faith are being mocked or silenced for what they believe. Fact. The people you claim to represent are begging for safety, but you call them hysterical." Hakeem's lips tightened. Karoline didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. Instead, she leaned slightly forward, her tone dropping into something that felt both intimate and confrontational, a voice that made everyone stop moving. "You laughed at my faith," she said, "but millions of Americans pray every day just to feel safe in the cities your policies shaped." A stillness swept across the room. No shuffling, no whispers, nothing but raw, charged silence. She continued, eyes locked directly onto Hakeem. "You mocked what gives people hope, and that tells us everything we need to know about the priorities of this Congress." A few members gasped. Others shifted uncomfortably. Hakeem's smug expression finally cracked. Karoline straightened, letting the silence burn for a moment before delivering the line that would replay on every news channel before sundown. "My faith doesn't make me weak, Congressman. But mocking it, mocking all Americans who believe, makes you look unfit to lead them." The room erupted, some clapping, some shouting, some simply stunned into frozen statues. Cameras flashed wildly. Staffers leaned over railings to get a better look. A reporter whispered, "That's the moment. That's the clip." Hakeem opened his mouth, searching for a comeback. But nothing came out. Karoline had taken the room, and Congress knew it. The chamber was still buzzing from the tension of the last exchange when Hakeem Jeffries leaned back in his chair, arms crossed, wearing that smug half-smile he used whenever he thought he'd scored a political point. His microphone light blinked on, and he exhaled dramatically, as if exhausted by what he called Karoline's emotional theatrics. Then he laughed. Not a quiet laugh. A loud, dismissive, echoing laugh that bounced off the walls of the committee room. "So, let me get this straight," he said, wiping a non-existent tear from his eye. "You expect Congress to take you seriously while you stand here quoting scripture and waving your little moral compass around like it's a governing document?" A few staffers chuckled behind him. One Democratic rep leaned over and whispered something that made Hakeem smirk even wider. But the rest of the room didn't laugh. They were waiting for her. Karoline didn't flinch. She didn't take the bait. She simply rose from her seat, slowly, deliberately, letting the silence stretch until even Hakeem's grin weakened. When she spoke, her voice was low, steady, and devastating. "Congressman Jeffries, you laughed at my faith like it makes me weak. But faith is the only reason half this country still believes in something worth fighting for." His smirk faded. Karoline stepped forward, hands on the table, eyes locked directly onto his. You say my moral compass isn't a governing document. But maybe if some people here actually had one, this country wouldn't be in the mess it's in. The room erupted. Gasps, murmurs, shifting chairs. Hakeem leaned forward, stunned. Karoline continued before he could recover. You mock my beliefs because you're used to people backing down. But let me be very clear. I don't answer to your jokes. I don't answer to your ego. I answer to the millions of Americans who are tired of watching you sneer at everything they hold sacred. The entire chamber froze. Even the reporters stopped typing. And, Congressman, she added, soft but lethal, if you think laughing at my faith wins you political points, wait until you see how America reacts when they hear you did it. A shiver moved through the room. Hakeem's microphone light went off. He didn't reach for it again. Karoline didn't just shut him down, she made him irrelevant. And everyone in Congress felt it. The hearing room had shifted. Subtly at first, then unmistakably. Hakeem Jeffries, who moments earlier sat relaxed and smirking, now adjusted his tie with the stiffness of a man realizing the room no longer belonged to him. The staffers behind him exchanged glances. Reporters leaned forward, sensing that something rare was unfolding. A congressional leader losing control, live. Karoline didn't capitalize on the silence with theatrics. She didn't need to. Instead, she stood still, hands resting on the table, her small silver cross glinting under the harsh committee lights. That alone felt like a direct rebuttal to Hakeem's earlier mockery. Mr. Jeffries, she said calmly, you keep insisting that my faith is some sort of political prop. But your reaction proves exactly why people of faith feel under attack in this country. You laughed at something millions of Americans hold sacred. And you didn't do it by accident. You did it because you thought nobody would call you out. A ripple moved through the room. Surprise, discomfort, recognition. Jeffries let out a short, incredulous scoff. Oh, please. Don't pretend your faith gives you immunity from criticism. Karoline stepped forward, eyes sharp as glass. My faith doesn't make me immune, she said. It makes me responsible. Responsible to speak honestly when leaders like you try to redefine morality and call it progress. The room stilled. Members who typically sided with Hakeem shifted in their seats. Even they knew she wasn't grandstanding. She was cutting straight through him. Karoline continued, her voice gaining force but never losing control. You call me divisive because I believe right and wrong exist. You call me dangerous because I refuse to bow to the cultural trends your party worships. But you know what truly fuels division, Congressman? Mocking Americans for believing in something bigger than government. Hakeem's jaw tightened. He started to respond, but she didn't give him the space. You think mocking my cross makes you bold? She shot back. It just proves you don't understand the people you claim to represent. People who wake up every day, raise their kids, work hard, pray quietly, and ask for nothing but freedom. Freedom to live what they believe without being humiliated by elected officials who should know better. A staffer behind Jeffries flinched. Reporters typed faster. Camera shutters clicked like rapid fire. Hakeem leaned into his mic, trying to reclaim ground. You're spinning this into some persecution fantasy. But Karoline didn't flinch. No, she said. I'm exposing the fantasy you live in. The fantasy that faith is outdated. The fantasy that people will stay silent while their values are mocked. You laughed at my faith to score political points, and now you're shocked that it backfired. A few quiet gasps rose from the back of the room. Some committee members actually nodded. Karoline finished with a line that froze even Hakeem himself. You laughed at my faith to make me small, but all you did was reveal how small your leadership has become. The hearing room erupted. Whispers, murmurs, even scattered applause before the chair slammed the gavel. Hakeem Jeffries sat frozen, his earlier confidence evaporating as he realized Karoline hadn't just defended her faith. She'd exposed his weakness, and the entire room had witnessed it. The chamber was already tense, but when Hakeem Jeffries leaned back in his chair, smirking as if the entire country existed for his punchlines, the atmosphere turned electric. "Maybe," he said loudly enough for the cameras to catch, "if Karoline spent less time preaching and more time learning, she'd understand how democracy actually works." A few members chuckled, but the laugh wasn't natural. It was nervous, like they sensed the blast coming. Karoline didn't react right away. She didn't flinch, didn't look away, didn't retreat. She simply placed her notes down, folded her hands, and let the silence stretch long enough to make every eye in the chamber lock onto her. Then she stood. Not fast, not dramatic, slow, controlled, deadly calm. "Hakeem," she said, her voice echoing through the room with a firmness that instantly erased the smirks. "My faith isn't something you get to score cheap laughs with, and it's definitely not something you get to belittle to avoid answering real questions." He blinked. The room froze. No shuffling papers, no whispering aides, no coughing lawmakers. Just quiet. Karoline stepped forward, her gaze locked on him like she was cutting through every layer of political armor he had. "You laugh at my faith," she continued, "yet you call yourself a defender of equality. You can't have it both ways. You don't get to preach tolerance while mocking what millions of Americans believe." A murmur rippled through the chamber, the kind that meant she'd hit the center of the target. Hakeem straightened, suddenly less amused. "Congresswoman, no one here is attacking your—" Karoline cut him off without raising her voice. "Let me finish." A gasp spread across the floor, because she never said it with aggression. She said it with authority. "You know why you mock faith," she added, "because you're terrified of people who stand on something stronger than political convenience. You're intimidated by anyone who refuses to bend to pressure, and you're threatened by every American who believes morals shouldn't change just because polls do." Several lawmakers turned toward Hakeem. Some shifted uncomfortably. Some looked impressed. Karoline leaned in just enough for the cameras to catch her expression. "You laughed at my faith," she said softly, "but the entire country is watching you dodge accountability. And trust me, they're not laughing with you." The chamber erupted, not with chaos, but with an unmistakable shift, a wave, a turning tide, and Hakeem Jeffries, for the first time that day, had no comeback. For a moment, the entire chamber felt frozen, like the oxygen had been pulled straight out of the air. Hakeem Jeffries stood there, jaw tight, fingers gripping the lectern as if it were the only thing keeping him upright. He hadn't expected pushback tonight, certainly not from Karoline, and definitely not from a line that spread across every phone in the room like wildfire. Karoline didn't move, didn't smile, didn't even blink. She simply let the silence stretch, letting every member of Congress feel the weight of what had just happened. Cameras hovered like vultures. Staffers pretended to shuffle papers, but every eye was up. Even the far corners of the gallery leaned forward, unable to look away. Hakeem finally cleared his throat. "Let's be serious here," he said, forcing a thin smile. "No one is attacking your faith. We're questioning your rhetoric, your pattern of using religion to—" "To what?" Karoline cut in softly. "To justify what millions of Americans already believe." A ripple went through the chamber. Shock, disbelief, maybe even admiration. She stepped forward, her voice unwavering. "You can laugh at my faith, Congressman. You can mock my Bible. You can roll your eyes every time I mention God or the Constitution. But what you can't do is pretend you're the moral authority in a country that's losing trust in every institution you represent." Hakeem's nostrils flared. "No one laughed at God. No," she said sharply, "you laughed at the people who live by Him." A murmur swept through the rows. Several lawmakers shifted uncomfortably. A Republican from Texas folded his arms and muttered, "She's right. Even a few Democrats didn't look thrilled to be standing behind Hakeem in this moment. Karoline took another step, closing the distance between herself and the podium. Her voice lowered, but somehow carried even farther. My faith doesn't make me dangerous. It doesn't make me extreme. It makes me accountable. And maybe that's what bothers you, Congressman, because accountability is something Congress stopped practicing a long time ago. The room went still. Hakeem opened his mouth, but nothing came out. Karoline pressed on. You laughed because faith scares you. Not mine. Your own lack of it. You laughed because a country grounded in values is harder to manipulate. You laughed because faith gives people strength, and strength makes them harder to control. A wave of whispers surged through the chamber. Every camera locked onto her. Every microphone shifted in her direction. And that, she said, pointing directly at Hakeem, is why you're uncomfortable. Not because of my beliefs, but because I'm not afraid to say them out loud. The chamber erupted, not in chaos but in something far more dangerous for Hakeem. Approval. Hakeem Jeffries stood frozen, one hand still lifted mid-gesture, as if the weight of Karoline's last sentence had stopped time around him. A few members of Congress shifted in their seats, the rustling of papers echoing louder than usual, as if the entire chamber sensed something historic was happening. Karoline didn't step back. She didn't soften. She didn't let the moment fade. She leaned forward, both hands resting on the edge of the podium, her voice steady and resonant enough to travel through the hall like a verdict. You laughed at my faith, she repeated, slower this time, because you thought it made me small. But faith isn't weakness. It's the only reason I stand here stronger than the mockery you throw. A ripple moved through the room, some murmuring, some nodding, and some deliberately looking away from Hakeem, who still hadn't recovered his usual polished posture. Karoline continued, her voice rising with controlled intensity. You say you're fighting for democracy, yet you mock the very beliefs that millions of Americans rely on to survive hardship, raise their families, and cling to hope. You didn't insult me, Congressman. You insulted every voter who lives by something greater than government. Hakeem tried to interject. That's not. But his voice cracked, weak, overshadowed by the resonance in hers. Karoline pressed on. You want to talk about unity? Unity doesn't come from laughing at people's convictions. Unity doesn't come from belittling faith because it doesn't fit your narrative. If anyone is fueling division, it's the leader who thinks faith is funny while pretending moral superiority in front of the cameras. A sudden, sharp silence filled the chamber. Even the staffers along the back wall looked up from their screens. Karoline took a breath, not to calm herself, but to let every word land with precision. You don't have to share my beliefs, she said, but you don't get to degrade them. Not here, not in this chamber, not while claiming you represent every American. For the first time all afternoon, Hakeem lowered his gaze. Karoline straightened her shoulders, her final words delivered in a calm, unshakable tone that carried farther than any shout. My faith is not a punchline, and the American people are done being laughed at by the very leaders who swear they serve them. A wave of applause erupted, not roaring, not chaotic, but steady, powerful, undeniable. Members from both sides of the aisle looked at her with a newfound seriousness, while Hakeem sat back in his chair, his earlier smugness completely gone. Karoline had not only defended her faith, she'd exposed his weakness. And Congress felt the shift. The chamber was still buzzing from the chaos of the last exchange when Karoline stepped back to the podium one final time. Cameras zoomed in. Staffers froze. Even the members, who normally scrolled through their phones during hearings, slowly lifted their heads, because everyone sensed she was about to deliver the line that would define the entire day. Hakeem Jeffries leaned back in his chair, arms crossed, the ghost of a smirk still lingering on his face. He had underestimated her once, mocked her faith, mocked her age, mocked her conviction, and the blowback was still rippling through the room. He didn't expect her to rise again, not with even more force. But Karoline Leavitt wasn't finished, not even close. "Leader Jeffries," she began, her voice calm but sharpened by conviction. "You can ridicule my beliefs all you want. You can laugh at my faith. You can try to paint it as outdated or irrelevant." She paused, letting the silence wrap around them. "But what you call weakness is the very strength that brought me here." A murmur swept across the chamber. Karoline continued, stepping toward the center of the room, the light catching the small cross on her necklace. "You say faith divides America. But tell me, what healed communities after tragedies? What carried families through wars? What held this nation together long before any of us were born?" She leaned in. "It wasn't politics. It was faith." Jeffries shifted, suddenly uncomfortable. "And you know what else?" she added. "You laugh at my faith because you can't defeat it. You can challenge my policies. You can argue with my positions. But you cannot break what I believe, and that terrifies you." The room erupted, some in gasps, some in applause, some frozen in disbelief that someone so young had just said what veteran members spent careers avoiding. Karoline turned, addressing the entire chamber. "America doesn't need leaders who mock what millions rely on to survive. America needs leaders who respect the people they claim to represent." Jeffries opened his mouth, but nothing came out. Karoline delivered the final blow. "My faith isn't the threat here. The real threat is a Congress that laughs at what Americans hold sacred." The chamber exploded. Cheers from Republicans, stunned silence from Democrats, and a roar from the balcony that echoed like a verdict. Phones went up. Clips were already being uploaded. Headlines were already forming. And as Karoline stepped away from the mic, even her critics knew Congress hadn't just witnessed a clash, it had witnessed a shift, a new voice, a new force, a new power rising in American politics. And Hakeem Jeffries, who had mocked her faith seconds earlier, was left staring at the floor, realizing he had just created the very thing he feared most. A star.